The crowd. Okay. So good morning. I hope you having a good summer. We have more rain than we had last year, so it's already a plus. And now let's sit back, relax, and let's enjoy that incredible tour of Mesoamerica. And I think you're going to be amazed by the number of incredible architecture that we're going to witness, indoor, outdoor. So before we start, as usual, you know, I like to give you a historical background, and we're going to look at the timeline. And I think this is really interesting timeline. You see that in 1325, the Aztecs constructed the Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was the place where Mexico was built later on. And in 1492, we have the first voyage of Christopher Columbus, and we'll go through that a little more in detail. That corresponds to the same year in Europe where the Moors and the Jews are expelled from Spain. In 1494, just after these first discoveries, there will be a very important treaty signed. It's called the Treaty of Tordesillas, and we will see too that the treaty is going to split the world literally between the new world, between Portugal and Spain. 1509 to 47 is the reign of Henry VIII in England. In 1519, Hernan Cortes enters Mexico. The same year starts the reign of Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor until his abdication in 56. In 1535, there is a viceroyalty of New Spain that is established. 1539, the printing press set up in Mexico City. In 1542, promulgation of new laws, and we'll see that too a little more in detail. And then we have a whole series of dates that gives you an idea of what happens in Europe during that time. We have the reign of Philip II in Spain, the reign of Queen Elizabeth in England, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the English settlement in 1607 at Jamestown, the 1636, the founding of Harvard University. In 1643 to 1715, the reign of Louis XIV in France, the longest reign in Europe. In 1667, we have that important expulsion of the Jesuits from Spanish America. Again, we'll go a little more about it, but this is an important moment too. Then we have in 1759 to 88, the Bourbon reform of Charles III. And the American Revolution, of course, 1776 to 83, the French Revolution between 1789 to 1795. Sorry for that mistake. 1810 to 24, the wars for independence among most of the states in Mesoamerica. And we have between 1807 and 08, Napoleon that occupies Portugal and Spain. And then finally, 1812, the War of 1812 in Spanish America. So it's really interesting to put the two next to one another, I think. I talked to you about the treaties of Tordesillas. Here is that was signed on the June 7, 1494, and literally divided the newly discovered lands outside Europe between the Portuguese Empire and the Crown of Castile along the meridians 370. And so what you have in blue here and turquoise is the Portuguese hemisphere. As you can see, it cuts through the map like this. Gives the Portuguese Brazil on the very left side. And then you have all the new places, the Strait of Hormuz, Aden, Mozambique, the Strait of Malacca, and the Philippine Islands, as well as part of Australia, to the Portuguese, whereas in Spain we have the whole western part of South America and Mesoamerica, and as we know, part of the what is now the United States. It also had an impact on the ocean. They considered what they call mare clausum, which is a sea under the jurisdiction of a single nation and not open to all others. So that was a very important thing. So the Pacific Ocean was considered purely Spanish, and you had to have permission to go through it. This lasted until 1790, when they were forced to admit free navigation of the Pacific. The Indian Ocean, on the other hand, became mare clausum for the Portuguese, but already by 1609 was unrecognized and gave free navigation to people. Here is a copy. Let's see if I can do it. A copy of the Treaty of Tordesillas. So this is more or less the way the Americas split. In green, this is Portuguese. In blue is all for the Spanish Empire. And of course, we have a few islands around here that are Portuguese, and then some that are Spanish. These are the Canaries Islands. So let's talk about that famous voyage, these famous voyages of Christopher Columbus. And then we'll see more in detail. The first voyage is in blue. He comes to Cuba first, going through the Bahamas, and then Santo Domingo, and then goes back. And that he goes back to Spain, comes back with the second voyage in red with that line, goes around Guadalupe, again, Santo Domingo, goes all the way to the end of Cuba, and then goes back to Spain. The third voyage in green, he comes through the Canary Islands and Madeira, and then touches the coast of South America, goes again through Santo Domingo and goes back. And then the fourth voyage in yellow, he's decided to try to find a way to reach India, which was the original goal of all these voyages, was to reach India for the spices, get another route than the more difficult route than the others were taking. And in doing so, touches Central America and then goes back. Here is detail that's in 1492, the first voyage, where he's on the Santa Maria Carac and followed by two caravels, the Pinta and the Nina. So you have here a more detailed of his trip, where he goes quite a bit on the coast of Cuba, and then Hispaniola, which is Haiti, and Santo Domingo, and then goes back. The second trip, he comes from this way, goes through Dominica, Guadalupe, Puerto Rico, then what was called Hispaniola, as I said, nowadays Haiti and Santo Domingo, Cuba, comes back through Jamaica, and then goes back to Spain. At that time, he comes with 17 ships with supplies to settle and 1,200 men, including by that time priests, farmers, and soldiers. They establish some slavery and what they call Encomienda, which is a labor system that was rewarding the conquerors with the labor of the conquered non-Christian people. The third voyage with 6 ships, 3 of these will go directly to Hispaniola with supplies that were, as you can imagine, quite needed. Columbus goes with the other 3 to still search to a passage to continental Asia, but doesn't do it, has to go back. And then finally, the last one, Columbus with his brother and son leaves Cadiz with his flagship Santa Maria again, and then other vessels, and this time touches the coast of Central America. So what is the result of all these contacts? Unfortunately, as you know, there were some epidemics that resulted in these contacts because of diseases brought by the Europeans to a population that was not at all immune against it. And so we have a whole series of epidemics. Smallpox, as you can see, many dates, 1518, 1521, 25, 58, 89, typhus in 46, influenza in 58, diphtheria in 1614, measles in 1618. And the result of these contacts literally killed between 10 and 100 million people, up to 95% of the indigenous population of the Americas. The labor, as we said, what happens is the settlers came and they started rounding up the population, the local population, and forced them into labors. This was so bad early on that some of the priests that came, they were monks, actually, they were not secular priests, but some of the monks that came took a ship back to Spain and complained to the king and the queen about the maltreatment of the indigenous population, so much so that they wrote the laws of Burgos in 1512 that forbade the maltreatment of the indigenous population and endorsed their conversion, of course, to Catholicism, but that's another story. They established, as I mentioned, what is called Encomienda of indigenous population. This brought many indigenous to work in the fields and mines in exchange for Spanish protection. They would get also education and a so-called seasonal salary, which was minimal. When they realized how many people had died in Central America, they got a shortage of labor. And so they brought some African people into slavery. They would buy them from actually African that had enslaved them themselves. And then sold them to Spaniards and to Portuguese and to others, as we know. So we know more or less now that in Spanish America, there were about 2.5 million of slaves that were brought from Africa, 4 million in Brazil. I'm not talking about North America. That was only about 250,000. Again, because of the excess of what happened with slaves, there was another kind of law that was written in the 19th century, what is called the freedom of womb. The fact that in Latin America countries, they forbade the enslavement of enslaved people's children at birth. So who were these religious people that we talk about? Because they were some of the big forces that actually converted or tried to convert the locals, but also brought a kind of an order within these countries. Why monks? At that time, secular priests were very illiterate. And so the preference went to monks that were typically quite learned and had some managing experience in the monasteries and what they were doing around the monasteries. So the first one that came were the Franciscan. And we will see how they come at first. So that's with the second voyage of Christopher Columbus. In 1493, come to Santo Domingo, 1522 in Mexico. And they really work on the urbanization, bringing people to try to, they educate them, they had schools and a whole system. There was also abuse. There's absolutely no contest with that. They were the only one that had access to the Yucatan. They educated the Maya youth, and they were a monastery school that would be specialized in bringing typically the sons of the chieftains to educate them before returning them to their village as now Christian schoolmasters. The Dominicans came second in 1510 in Santo Domingo, 1526 in Mexico, 1531 in Peru. And then came the Augustinians. So that was a little later. Because of their later arrival, they will be confined in more remote places because the rest was already taken. And then came the Jesuits. They only came to Mexico in 1572. They had a different agenda. They also had an education agenda. We will talk about the reducciones, especially in South America, where they organized some kind of small towns that were purely organized by them and was very much protecting the population against the excess of the settlers. Because of political and religious reasons, they were expelled between 1759 and 73 from South America and literally forbidden to express their religion in Europe too. So the Jesuit order was at the time proscribed until finally in 1814 it was restored. So also an important date for us when we're looking at the churches is the fact that in 1859, the reformed laws nationalized much of church property in Mexico. So I wanted to show you here the map of Mexico, the way it existed in 1819. So you have an idea, it goes all the way to Upper California, Santa Fe, New Mexico. We have no Arizona on the map, the New Philippines. So as you see, the map was extremely different, and it goes all the way to the Viceroyalty of Nueva Granada, Spain, so in the northern part of South America. And then for the sake of my talk, I give you this map to show you more or less how I'm going to do, because I had to give an order. So we can see that through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, this part goes to the United States. We have Texas independence in 1836. And then Guatemala is going to split in 1823. So looking at that map that is a little older than what I would have, I'm going to start, for the sake of it, with Mexico City, which is here, and then try to go around by Querétaro, Guanajuato, San Luis Potosí, Zacatecas, Chihuahua. And then we'll go back down, Jalisco, Guerrero, Morelos, Puebla, in Tlaxcala here, then go down to Oaxaca, Chiapas, and Yucatan before we move to the countries of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and then Panama down there. So the training to construct all the churches that we're going to see, at first came some trade people from Spain, and they followed the same pattern as they were in Spain itself. So in Spain, you had the trades of the bricklayer, architect, and master builder. They all were meant to be positioned, given to different individuals. So that was really split in between. A person would study to occupy one of these three trades: an albañil, an architect, or alarife, the master builder. In New Spain, holding the title of architect could mean holding one or all three position in the early centuries. They didn't have enough people to be so specific. And so we have some great names like Lorenzo Rodriguez, Pedro de Arrieta, and Jerónimo de Balbás. After 1746, there were ordenanzas proposed to officially change the construction trade into an art. Now, only a Spaniard could be a master in architecture. And so the indigenous population and the mestizos were excluded from the profession. And finally, what they had to do is they had to learn their trade by attending artist studio lessons, and they formed special groups, classes and studios where they learn by themselves, and we'll see the extraordinary thing that they will do, which is much more tainted of the local beliefs that will cross with the Catholic iconography. Styles, we have the Chirurgueresque style that comes from Spain, from Chirurguere, the architect that worked in the 18th century in Spain. But when that style came to Mexico, it fitted in the mentality of people and it absolutely exploded. So we'll see how many churches actually have that Chirurgueresque facade and then the Chirurgueresque retablo inside. So it really means, when you see a Chirurgueresque, is that horror vacui, the idea of hating anything empty, so everything is filled up. But going on top of that art that comes from Spain, we'll see outside of Mexico the indigenous Tequitqui art, which is really the embodiment of the Mexican identity. We see flowers, abundance of nourishment, rain, offering for Tlaloc, the god of rain, presentation of water and blood in Mexican architecture and sculpture were not rooted on of the Christian image. So this is a really interesting marriage, if you want, is between the Catholic iconography and then that indigenous art. So let's start our presentation on churches. The oldest European city in America in 1498 was Santo Domingo. And the church, the first cathedral that was built was there in Santo Domingo, built between 1512 and 41. It's made of solid limestone walls. It has 3 doors, 2 of which are Gothic, and then the main door that you see here, which is Plateresque. The idea of Plateresque is having these very differentiated portals with an abundance of sculpture, low relief, different friezes, very sophisticated entrances compared to a rather simple walls on both sides. On the doors, you have the arms, the coat of arms, and the emblems of the Castilian royal family, as well as the bust of actually the statues of the evangelist. The main door that you see there weighs 2.5 tons, and they date back to the creation of the church. They were restored for the 500th anniversary of the discovery of the Americas. And here is an aerial view, so you can see the size, the sheer size of the church that contains 12 side chapels, 3 aisle, and a nave, as you can see on the right. The length of the basilica is 177 feet, so it's a pretty long church. The interior, as you can see on the right, the church has many retablos, paintings, old woodwork, and so on, including the main altar that is a 17th century altar made of solid mahogany. The remains of Columbus were first buried at the convent in Valladolid and then moved to the monastery of La Cartuja in Sevilla. That was according to the will of his son Diego. Then they were exhumed in 1513 and interred in the Cathedral of Seville. Around 1536, the remains of both Columbus and his San Diego were moved to the Cathedral of Santo Domingo, so the one that you just see there, what is now the Dominican Republic. According to some accounts, around 1796, when the French took over the island of Hispaniola, the remains were moved to Havana, Cuba, and we'll see the church there. And it's after Cuba's independence that they were finally returned to Seville Cathedral in 1898. Some DNA research have been done on the bones and were not very conclusive. So let's imagine that he is in Seville. In Cuba, we have that extraordinary facade of the Cathedral of La Havana that was built between 1748 and 77. The island was first landed on in 1492, and then the first settlement was in 1511 by Diego Velázquez de Cuellar. The cathedral itself is actually, it's quite interesting, is influenced by the style of Francesco Borromini, who was the great architect in the 18th century and definitely the most celebrated. The largest missionary group in Havana was the Society of Jesus, and so they planned the building of the church. So this is in this cathedral that the remains of Christopher Columbus transited, in a sense. Moving to another island, here's Puerto Rico, the Cathedral of San Juan Bautista, built in 1540. They arrived in Puerto Rico during Puerto Rico in the second voyage in 1493, the end of 1493, and named the island San Juan Bautista in honor of St. John the Baptist. By 1508, they had their first settlement and had the first governor in the island. So the cathedral here is one of the oldest buildings in San Juan and the oldest cathedral in the United States, as we know. The cathedral contains, by the way, the tomb of the Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon. Here is a view of the old San Juan, and you can see the cathedral here. But we're going to look at this church, which is the San Jose Church, which is also a very pretty, very simple facade, very organic. Here is that church that was constructed between 1532 and 1735. It was at first built by the Dominican order, and then was renamed, was passed to the Jesuits, which renamed it the Church of San Juan. The interior of the church had been influenced by each of the order that occupied it, and actually it was occupied at the end by what they call Vincentian fathers, Padres Paules, which is a smaller order. So what I'm showing you here is the interior. In some of the chapels, they found some of these frescoes that they have been painfully trying to restore, because you can see a lot of losses. But these frescoes that were made between the 17th century and the 19th century show even the Battle of Lepanto, which is quite interesting when you think about the distance with the original battle. So, but it was something significant for them. And also some other themes are actually themes of conquest. And of course, in Puerto Rico, you have these lovely neighborhoods with Spanish style in the old San Juan. So moving to Mexico, I showed you the map. I'm going to start here in Mexico City. And before actually I talk about Mexico City, I'm going to go to Cuernavaca, that is there, to show you one of these lay buildings. So this was the Palace of Cortes that he had built in Cuernavaca. That was seen very much as a symbol of the Spanish rule by the native Indians. This is the oldest conserved colonial era civil structure in the continental Americas. It has been turned into jail, as often these buildings are, and it's now quite a beautiful museum. Of course, the jewel of Mexico is its cathedral. And before I go on even in other churches, we have to realize, I had to make a choice, and you'll see many, many churches, but we'll have to make a choice in what I had to leave behind and not. There are many, many others than the ones I'm showing you. We have to think of the country, and a country prone to earthquakes. So a lot of the beautiful churches have incurred terrible damages due to the numerous earthquakes that happen in Mexico and that whole central part of the Americas. So between that, the revolution, the revolts that existed before the revolutions of independence, just the indigenous population revolting against the order, if we can call it that way. So this really is going to make the landscape of what we're going to see, churches that have been rebuilt and so on. So this is obviously as I say, the jewel of Mexico City, the Metropolitan Cathedral that was started in 1553 and went all the way to 1813. And then connected to it on the right, the Sagrario that has that extraordinary Churrigueresque facade, as you can see, very ornamented. And it comes out of these rather simple walls made of local bricks. The cathedral is built on the northern side of what is called the Plaza de la Constitución, el Zócalo, in downtown Mexico City, and was built just next to the Templo Mayor of the Aztecs. And there are right now some excavation, not really pretty close to the cathedral, where they're trying to find the basis of the Templo Mayor built by the Aztecs. What is interesting, there are high relief on the portals of the cathedral that were inspired by Peter Paul Rubens, the Flemish painter. As we know, as I just mentioned, the cathedral has suffered a lot of damage along the centuries. But one of the latest damage that occurred is a fire in 1967 that destroyed a significant part of the cathedral's interior. Though sometimes there is a silver lining to a drama, they at the same time uncovered, in doing the restoration work, they uncovered a number of important documents and artwork that had previously been hidden. Also, don't forget that Mexico is built on what used to be a lake. And so even if the lake has been drained, it's still an unstable ground. And you can imagine that the weight of such a building is giving a stress, if you want, to the foundation. So what is down below is a soft clay soil. So they had, because they could feel that the cathedral was unstable, the water tables were dropping, So they literally went under the cathedral and solidified the foundation. This started in 1990. Now on the right, as I mentioned, is that incredible facade of the Sagrario, which is constructed of red porous volcanic rock called Tezontle. It is shaped as a Greek cross. The two arms are the same name, and is connected through one of the chapels of the cathedral to the cathedral. The architect that designed the facade is the famous Jerónimo de Balbás, that we'll see that name coming back again and again. I'm not going to show you the high altar, the main altar, because it has been changed about 4 times to finish with a very modern altar that is, I think, less appealing in such a decor. So the 2 main altars that I'm going to show you is the altar of the kings, the one that you see there, very typical of Chirurguesque style, with what we call the estipite column, which means it's kind of an inverse triangle that are really one of the main characteristics of the Chirurguesque art. It was begun in 1718 by Balbás. It's made of cedar and gilded with gold leaves. It is located at the back of the cathedral and is called the Retablo de los Reyes because of the numerous statues that are there, showing a whole series of kings and queens. There are 6 female royal saints: St. Margaret of Scotland, Helena of Constantinople, Elizabeth of Hungary, Elizabeth of Aragon, and the Empress Cunegunda. There are 6 canonized kings: Henry II, Holy Roman Emperor, Edward the Confessor, Casimir of Poland, Louis of France, Ferdinand III of Castile, and so on. So again, incredible retable. As you can see, it's just gold, gold, gold. And we know that the Spaniards found gold. They very quickly found out that the Indians had gold objects and then tortured them until they would say where the mines were. And so this is part of the gold that they conquered. So we have a mixture of paintings framed with elaborate frames, and on the side also some Life of the Virgin and others. The most striking, I think, though, is the altar of forgiveness, which is the first thing you see when you come into the cathedral. It's at the front of the central nave. You have to contour it to see the rest of the nave and the high altar. It is also made by Jerónimo Balbás, and is also recognizable because of his estipite columns, this inverse triangle. Why the altar of forgiveness? It's really interesting. The first states say that the condemned by the Spanish Inquisition were brought to the altar to ask for forgiveness in the next world before the execution. But the second one relates to a Belgian painter that came with the explorers to establish some school and have some work. The problem was that we had at that time some painters that were taking the whole fame in Antwerp, for example, and then he came because he had to find some work. So Simon Perez came to Mexico and stayed there for about 20 years, painted different things, but was given actually the commission to paint many of the paintings that you have on the altar of the kings, and to paint other works in actually other churches too. But for whatever reason, and we're not sure at all, he was accused of blasphemy and thrown in jail. And the only way he was able to get out of jail was to paint that beautiful painting that is in the center of the altar piece, of the altar, that is called the Virgin of Forgiveness. And apparently it was so beautiful that he was given his freedom once he had finished. Unfortunately, during the famous fire in 67, the painting was very much damaged. And I have not been able to find if this is the same painting that has been restored or if it's just a copy. But so the main paintings there was by Simon Perrins. It was, so the whole altar was completely restored. Now, an interesting side conversation is the Lord of the Cocoa Bean. The Lord of the Cocoa Beans, we have to know that the cocoa bean was very important in Mesoamerican history. We talked about it when we talked about pre-Columbian history. It was not only used for food, but mostly for medicinal purpose and as offering to the gods. And so we see here that kind of transfer from the religion of the Aztecs and other population around then to the Catholic faith, because they just went on doing it. The priests were really shocked when they had a mass that the indigenous population would be there drinking cocoa. And they didn't realize that for them, it was just honoring the gods when they were doing so. So at first they forbade it, and then they realized that it wouldn't work. And so the natives really raised quite a fuss when the Pope declared that they were not supposed to break fast by drinking liquid. So finally they admitted that when the natives would come, that they offer the cocoa beans to a figure just like that Christ. And this is not unique to Mexico City. There exist in others. You can see at the foot of the figure there of the image of Christ, the cocoa that is gathered in some dishes and glasses. At that time, it was the full cocoa bean, and these were so precious and valuable that some of the priests made a fortune with having it and then reselling it. So again, there we have that interesting image of superposition of beliefs, that just a transfer of beliefs from the old beliefs to what was imposed on them, but they kept the same rituals in a sense. Beside the cathedral, there are many churches, of course, in Mexico City, but again, many are in bad condition because of the soil. Here, La Santissima, which is the church of the Most Holy Trinity, is one of the incredible churches as far as the architecture is concerned. Again, very Chirurgeresque portal with the columns, the inverted triangle, so the stipite columns there. It's by now, it was built with a hospital and some administrative buildings adjoined to it, and a hospice for the priest also. But again, the stability of the ground in Mexico, under Mexico City, has caused a lot of problem for the church. They also raised the ground of the floor of the church to avoid flooding. The side portal there, as you can see, is also beautifully sculpted with St. Peter in the main niche. Of course, the Plaza de las Americas in Mexico with the Church of the Virgin of Guadalupe, at least previously. This is the new church that has been built because this one was not only getting dangerous, because as you can see, it's totally slanted again because of the ground. Also, it was too small for the enormous crowd that comes to the church on pilgrimage regularly. The old church has was restored and finally is back open to the public. Here is the church, what is called the Templo Expiatorio a Cristo Rey, the old Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And in its interior, of course, it doesn't have anymore the image of the Virgin of the Guadalupe, which is by now preserved in the new temple. So this one incurred a lot of damage too, because in 1921, a bomb was planted in a flower vase near the altar by an anti-clerical terrorist. This, of course, caused a lot of damage, but it has been restored. Behind the church, on the hill behind, is that very special chapel, the El Pocito. El Pocito is a Franciscan church. It was built in 1777 over the sacred spring on the hill of Tepeyac that is overlooking the Basilica of Guadalupe. It was loosely based on the Pantheon of ancient Rome, but if anything, when you look at it, architecture, it has nothing classical. There is a mixture of classical things, Chivalresque, but also Moorish architecture, Moorish architecture. It is built with that reddish, dark red, actually, volcanic tezontle. So it's a volcanic origin stone that you can see, this very reddish iron oxide, of course. And then you have these quite incredible tiled roof, star-shaped windows, these protruding entrance that comes out of that Pantheon-like architecture. And when you come in, very interesting is the ceiling, all these beautiful blue tiles that make the ribs of the dome. So this has been looked at, as you can see, so different that some people said that it was the last major Baroque church in Mexico, but some look at it as a prelude to the innovative neo-stilo phase in Mexican architecture. In Guadalajara, northwest of Mexico, is the Cathedral of Our Lady. Very different kind of architecture. The interesting thing that the first church was made of wood and with also a wooden ceiling. And then in 1574, the neighbors fired shots into the air, and some of the bullets fell onto the cathedral and started a fire, which damaged the building. And so they had to rebuild the church and build this one cathedral. In 1818, it was damaged by an earthquake, and another one in 49. As you can imagine, these towers must be very unstable in case of strong earthquake. Then one more of these Chivalresque facades for the Church of San Francisco Javier, which is now the National Museum of Viceroyalty, and really a place not to miss. It's not too far. It's only 40 kilometers northeast of Mexico City. And the main church, it was also a convent, Jesuit convent, but probably one of the most important Baroque Chivalresque created at that time. And it has been turned into a museum, and you will understand why I really insist on that. It was, at the time, it was built part of 3 centers of learning: a school to teach indigenous languages to Jesuit evangelists, a school for Indian boys, and then the College of San Francisco Javier to train Jesuit priests. So this was quite a complex. It had dormitories, library, kitchen, domestic chapel, etc., and 2 churches. The Church of San Francisco Javier that you see here, and the Church of San Pedro Apostol. So it has been converted into a museum that houses some of the most important collection of Chiriguaresque altarpiece in Mexico, as well as a whole series of artifacts. So I'm going to show you a series of oh, sorry, I didn't do it well, but this is the central altarpiece. I had an image of the whole thing. You can see other altarpiece on the side, but the amazing image of that high altar by Eugenio Chavez. Again, and here is better view of the incredible horror vacui, the idea of not a single place is empty. So you have cherubs, you have statues of saints, St. John the Baptist I can see, and others. St. Francis in the middle. I don't think he would have approved of the luxury of that altarpiece. And then God the Father on the very top. But every single piece of surface is filled up with embellishment. Another of the altarpieces that are shown there is altar to Saint Joseph that we see in the middle. It's surrounded by other sculpture of monks and other saints, and then some of the paintings showing actually here the marriage of Mary and Joseph. Or in the domestic chapel, that main altar dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and so with more paintings than sculpture. There's not only churches, but of course, this is where they put most of the money. But I wanted to show you some engineering marvel. This is the Khalpang aqueduct built by the Jesuits in 1704, and that is in Tepoztlan, Mexico. Is a length of 438 feet and a height of 200 feet. And you can see the size of it when you see the people there at the base. North of Mexico is the city of Querétaro, only 250 kilometers. Southeast, no, northeast from Mexico City is the city of Querétaro. This is in the state of Querétaro. And I'm showing you this map because it shows how the Spaniards were building it very much like a castrum with the Romans in the very grid-like fashion. And then you had on the surrounding, these were the locals, habitants that were much more fantasy-like. The population around there with the Otomi, the Tarasco, and the Chichimeca. This city is important because during the 19th century, during the Mexican-American War, the capital was moved from Mexico City to Querétaro. It's actually there that the Emperor Maximilian will be executed. A lovely Casa de la Marquesa. This was a mansion in the center of Querétaro that very typically Baroque. It's actually almost Rococo in its grace and very beautiful proportions. It's interesting, she constructed this palace for herself about 2 blocks away from her husband. And I think she probably didn't want to know everything he was doing. I don't know. But this is absolutely beautifully done, very elegant type of construction with, of course, the coat of arms of the family. That's the family of de Urrutia y Arana. Another church, it's a small church, a Santa Clara in Querétaro. But the reason why I bring it is to show the Tequitqui type of art that I mentioned before. It's that art that is really appealing to the imagination of the indigenous population. So instead of having just saints, we have not only saints, but we have fruits and animals and vegetation that mix and brings in some of the offerings that the Indians would do to their own gods. So this is the product of an indigenous artist, and we'll see that this is going to be comparable to some of the facade we'll see outside of Mexico City. A whole series of missions were built at the arrival of Junipero Seha that founded that Franciscan missionary that came in, very, very influential, not only in Mexico, but of course also in the south of the United States. And so here are actually 5 of the mission that he built, or his companion built it, but under his advice and guidance. And so I'm just going to show you these very quickly, but they're just very pretty in incredible condition. This is the church of Khalpang, the Seha, dedicated to St. James the Greater. This was established before the arrival of Junipero Serra in 1744, but he was then in charge of building it on top of the small mission that existed before. Very similar in style is the mission at Tancoyol. And then the other 2, the mission church of San Miguel Conca and San Francisco del Valle in Tilaco. Again, very interesting facade. The coloring is quite interesting. But beside the sculptures that represent Catholic saints, you have a whole iconography that really is rooted in the original indigenous beliefs. And Santa Maria de la Guadelanda. So before I move to Guanajuato, I will probably ask you to just, for 5 minutes, just go get a coffee, stretch your legs, and ask me a question. Unmute yourself and tell me what you think. No questions? You can. Yes, John.
Oh no! I mean, I'm just thinking about one something I never thought about when you presented the indigenous artists in Querétaro and the bringing of fruits and the whole thing. I will think about the Day of the Dead, the Mexicans.
Yeah, exactly.
The cemetery with fruits and
yeah.
the food that their dead ones, loved ones, like it. And is an extension of the Aztec. I never thought about
it. And prior to the Aztecs. Yeah. So this is absolutely rooted in these prior beliefs. And so that all these populations are forced to become Catholic and to worship because otherwise they're in trouble. And so they just bring their rituals with them. And this makes the whole iconography so much richer, because it is such a reflection of what they believed before. And you're going to see more of these. I mean, that Mexico is so rich in churches, it's unbelievable. And I know you've seen the presentation I had given on Church of the 18th century, but here I expanded it on earlier works and sometimes a little later. But it's absolutely mind-boggling, and I had to cancel. So, you know, I had seen some, and I said, should I show it? And I said, no, I can't. I'm running out of time. So it's really interesting. And the contrast of the very early one, like the one we see right now in Guanajuato, is such fortress-like. And then you have the missions that come, and the missions become so much more gentle because they try to attract the people, not to defend themselves against the people.
Cool.
So it's I think it's amazing. No other questions?
If you allow me, I have just a comment. This
Please.
Churrigueresque style, seem to have had more life in Americas than in Spain.
Absolutely. Very few examples in Spain, but was brought here and must have really pleased the population that liked these sculptures. And, you know, when you look at the temples and all the sculptures and the low relief, it's no surprise that they like this.
Yeah.
We also have to remember that all the temples we saw prior, the pre-Columbian things, were all polychromed. We see them now in just gray color because it's just the stone, but all that used to be painted. Oh, wow. So for them, the Churrigueresque and what we see, the gold, there was a lot of gold also in the temples, but that has been taken away. Cool. So for them, this is just, again, it's an application of the old beliefs to the new one. And this is human. It's not only between the Indian beliefs and the Catholic thing. It's a cycle that happens all the time. If you go back, you know, the Olmecs, when the Olmecs died down, you have the Mayan that come in. They kind of look at what the Olmecs did. If they were fighting against the Olmec, they would just put away what the Olmecs were doing and imposing their own gods to the Olmecs. So that's, you know, you see that in Egypt with the different dynasties, they often just scratch out the face of the old pharaoh to make sure that they're forgotten when they are the most important. So this seems to be a human habit.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
So if everybody seems to be stay put, I'm going to go on. And I'm going to mute. John, maybe you can mute yourself.
Yeah.
Do you want me to do it? No, okay. So I think everybody is muted. I'll do it just in case. Okay, so we're going to go on and go to the state of Guanajuato, which is north of Mexico, and is a mining state. The discovery of silver and gold in that area, of course, attracted the Spaniards, and they started settling in that area around 1520 and 30, so very early on. But when the Spaniard arrived, the population retreated in the most inaccessible areas, and there are lots of mountains around that place. And they really resisted the invaders, which was not the case of old population. They attacked the settlements. They really had their vendetta continuously along the routes that connected the Spanish settlements and the mining camps. So because they were unable to use the local indigenous population, they brought African slaves and indigenous people from other areas to force them to work in the haciendas and in the mines. So the San Agustin de Uriria convent was part of that Augustinians' effort to evangelize the population. And of course, at that time, Guanajuato was outside of Mexico City. And so this is where they were able to do it, where there were no Franciscans nor Dominicans. As you can see too, this looks more like a stronghold than as a convent. Another of these old convent, also Augustinian, is by Pedro Del Toro de San Agustin Uriria. Sorry, that's the same. What am I doing there? Yeah, that's the same, actually. I thought it looked pretty. So the architect was Pedro Del Toro. the only beautifully crafted place is that entrance that is here on the side and that you see here more in detail. And again, with that rather forbidden architecture, we now have that space that is really framing the entrance into the church with all kind of details of columns, and you have statues, some vegetation motifs. Some look rather Moorish when you look at it, and of course San Augustine at the very top. But you see here you have cornucopias and other that are actually a reinterpretation of European prints and engraving. I'm showing you one hacienda because this one is actually, it's also in the state of Guanajuato. One of the most important haciendas of the colonial era. It's huge. Unfortunately, it's pretty much abandoned. It hasn't been transformed in a hotel or used for another purpose. But the family that had it still owns it and is not doing anything. The only thing they're doing now is tequila in the backyard, if we can call it. But here is the former chapel belonging to the hacienda. The family of Miguel de Berrio y Salvidar was given the hacienda in the 1774, and so it then consequently housed a whole series of many generations of the same family. By the time of the Mexican Revolution, the last of the lineage, was considered the richest man in Mexico. So haciendas, we have to realize, were very autonomous, and they were almost self-governed world. And they had their own parish church, they had a school, they had a post office and a railway, of course, in the 19th century. And everything was overseen by the owner. So let me show you. This was so extraordinary. This is the inside. You can see there were frescoes in the ceilings, columns, Corinthian columns framing the windows. But you have now here the barrels of tequila ready to be shipped. And as I mentioned, most of the old haciendas, if they were in good enough conditions, have been turned lately into hotels or for different buildings. And I have the memory in the early 70s to go to Mexico and be able to spend some time in this hotel, as that old hacienda that is now turned into the Hotel Hacienda Vista Hermosa in Tequesquitengo. And it's an absolutely extraordinary place, despite the very forbidding facade. But you enter and you have that great hallway. By the way, some of the films of Zorro were filmed in there. In the superb swimming pool with a bridge going through, and some of the Chacmol sculptures set into the pool. The rooms are in the where the old rooms of the family that was owning the hacienda, and there is still the church, and the church is right now used as the restaurant. It doesn't have any ceiling anymore, but I see that now they have covered part of it, and there were little chapels and all that, just with nothing around. You could see the Mexican with his hat on the mule going by from time to time. It was absolutely beautiful. This is just not far from Cuernavaca, by the way. Okay, enough of old memories, but in Guanajuato, again, we mentioned the fact that it's a mining town. And so, because some people became so rich, then they commissioned the construction of churches close to the mines, to the entrance of the mines. And this is one of the treasures, the San Cayetano Church, so dedicated to San Cayetano. It's also called La Valenciana because it was commissioned by the family of Valenciana family. You can see inside that incredible high altar, again, very typically Chirurgeresque with the kind of sculptures and the columns, the inverse columns. Just a lot of money. There's multiple chapels, including this one that is called the Capilla del Chavo, the Holy Spirit, that is an octagonal chapel with each wall covered with paintings, and a lot of painters there are known painters that came from Spain or from the Netherlands or from Italy and painted, sometimes actually paintings on copper. Another church in Guanajuato, you don't have it on my list of illustration because I found it just before, is another of these Chirurgeresque facade. But with a much more simple Baroque, very European flavored type of main altar. Still in Guanajuato, in Salamanca, is this Parroquia Antica, a temple dedicated to San Bartholomew the Apostle, because of course, being the patron saint of the founder of the city. It is now known as the ancient parish. Again, we have that very Chirurgeresque facade, but then it's surrounded by that beautiful ochre, yellow ochre around it. And a detail of the sculptures, as you can see, quite beautiful. North of there is San Juan, northeast of there is San Juan Potosi, the state of San Juan Potosi, and the Basilica of San Juan de los Lagos. Quite imposing as far as the structure, but for the very reason that it houses the image of Our Lady of San Juan de los Lagos, also known in the Nahuatl as Tihuapili, that very small statue of the Virgin, about 38 centimeter high, which is that's 18, about 15 inches in height, and made of sugarcane paste. Is the reason for all that pilgrimage. And we have tremendous pilgrimage. It's the second largest pilgrimage after the Guadalupe in Mexico. And so that's a miraculous statue that has granted miracles since the early 1500s. Since the early 1600s, sorry. Where it revived a little girl that had fallen and had died, and being exposed to the image of the Virgin, she revived. And so this is quite interesting to see how it attracted. The city is actually struggling to house all these pilgrims when they come, because they are far more numerous than any of the accommodation that exists there. Going still north, but northwest this time, we go to Zacatecas and the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Assumption. Again, as John was saying, that explosion of the Chirurgeresque style that really pleases people and makes the architecture, the 18th century architecture in Mexico so interesting. Chihuahua, quite a bit north, is a common border with the United States. With the Metropolitan Cathedral, again, we have an amazing porch, the two quite work towers, Solomonic columns, which means twisted columns that were supposed to be used in the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. Of course, the clock is 19th century. And here is one of the side entrance of the Blessed Sacrament Chapel. Going back south from there, we go to the state of Guerrero, and I wanted to show you this ex-Dominican monastery that was so extravagant that it was never finished, though this was finished, but just unfortunately suffered from the damage of time. The Dominicans had started this complex in the 1550s. And this was quite interesting because it had Gothic, Renaissance, Plateresque, and Mudéjar elements. And then, of course, some indigenous elements too. But again, unfortunately, there was a lot of abuse of the Encomienda system that forced the native population to come and work for the monks. So here we see that incredible size of this work that was halted in 1570, and we're not quite sure why. There could be the fact that they had lack of funds, that it was so sumptuous that the authorities stopped it. There could have been a dispute on the construction. But also is a problem is that the population declined so much that in the 1520s, the population there was of 43,000 people, and 80 years later was down to 7,000. So not enough workers. But let's look at the facade. We have again that kind of plateresque facade, simpler than chirurgeresque, a pediment that would have, of course, had the wood, the supported the ceiling, and that the incredible proportion of we have the nave and then one aisle on each side. There was, of course, a whole complex around that with a regular chapel, a hospital, a school, etc. I'm just going to show you some of the work I find. All the walls. When you don't have the golden decoration, what you find is a lot of frescoes. And so here you have frescoes of the story of Saint Dominic. Then I moved to Taxco, not too far from there, with the Church of Santa Prisca and San Sebastian. Ultra Baroque and chirurgeresque architecture with the dome on the crossing. And here is the facade. You can see the work. So again, that amazing porch there, and then with very elaborate towers, with a very simple that are framing the plateresque porch, but then the upper part is very elaborate. And the cupola that we have seen before was covered with colored tile. Again, Taxco is an important silver mining location. And so this brought a lot of settlers and a lot of money. Some of the altarpieces dedicated to Santa Prisca and San Sebastian. Another whole series of altarpieces, as you can see. And the organ, which comes later at the end of, this is a 19th century piece. Moving east to the state of Morelos, an old monastery of San Mateo Atlatahuacan. Sorry for the pronunciation. Again, is Augustinian monastery. As I say, they would go to remote place where the others were not. It's again very forbidding, but huge in dimension, in proportion. And you can see that beautiful frame of that other entrance to the church. Inside, a very simple, it's just a one nave, but a whole series of little personal altar have been set for the different saints. But whereas this would have been entirely painted, but has been overpainted with white, the apse is still showing some of the original paint, as you can see here on the ceiling, with kind of traceries, with angels in between. And then in the convent itself, we have the whole panel with the genealogy of Saint Dominic and the Dominicans going back to Jesus. Very interesting frescoes. And again, you know, the weather or whatever has unfortunately damaged most of the frescoes, but most of these churches had lots of frescoes. Still in Morelos, the previous convent, Dominican convent of Tepoztlan, with a very interesting porch. This is not chirograph, but actually very much a mixture of Christian iconography and indigenous iconography. So you have the Virgin of the Rosary that is accompanied by saints, angel, and cherubs. But then you also have around that some images of, again, fruits and vegetation and animals. Sometimes even mermaids are shown. And I wanted to show you something that is contemporary here, but it's the that's a whole panel that is made of seeds showing the battles between the indigenous population being killed by the Spaniards, conquerors. This is made of seeds. And this is contemporary, of course. But the small state of Tlaxcala is quite connected with the state of Mexico, has an extraordinary Basilica of Ocotlan, dedicated to the Virgin of Ocotlan. Again, this is part of apparition, and it's a site of a pilgrimage. When you have such a large complex, it's very typically there is a pilgrimage behind. The interior is again magnificent with very ornated ceilings, the shell that is quite Renaissance, but with a very Baroque altarpiece. They're all always mixed with a miracle. This was built on a source that appeared magically. In Puebla, so we have the large state of Puebla, extremely rich state that shows us a great panorama of architecture. Very early one, like the Monastery of San Miguel Arcangel in Huejotzingo, Puebla. Very forbidding architecture again. Puebla is a really interesting place because it showed a very rapid growth of industries that brought prosperity to the colony. In 1566, it became the first city in the Americas to produce large amount of wool. And then not only did they have production of textiles, but also glass and ceramics. And this is in Puebla that you can find the Talavera pottery, ceramics, and tiles. In the mid-1600s, the first printing press arrived in Puebla, which made it a major cultural center in Mexico. So this monastery was founded by the Franciscans in 1525. And it makes it one of the oldest monasteries in the Americas. Inside here, you have a little chapel on the northwest corner of the atrium. They often had a large atrium with little chapels on each corner. And then here, the mural depicting the first 12 Franciscans in Mexico. At the interior of the church is the great retable made of a mixture of sculptures and paintings. This is, by the way, a retable painting by Simon Perez, the Flemish painter that came to live in Mexico. Overlooking, we're going to see two churches. This is seen from the height of a pyramid we are right now located on, if you can imagine it. And it's a view of the San Gabriel Franciscan Convent in the city. The San Gabriel Church in Cholula, it is in Puebla, was established in 1529 by the Franciscan, but the Order of Friar Minors. And this was already on top of the destroyed temple of Quetzalcoatl, with the idea, of course, of evangelizing the population. It has a whole complex again with chapels, hospitals, churches, schools, etc. The church itself has again that kind of forbidding aspect with the crenellated roof, but then inside an incredibly elegant, I would say again almost Rococo interior. Connected to the church is the Capilla Real, the royal chapel that has nothing royal, and we're not quite sure why it's called that way, but has very interesting architecture. It has 49 cupolas that are making it so very close to the building of Spanish mosques that would follow that similar architecture as we can see in Cordoba, for example. And then inside, you have that whole series of pilasters and columns. The height that we were looking at this from is actually a former pyramid. It would have been the highest pyramid in Mexico and was, in a sense, decapitated by the conquerors, and they built a church on the very top of the pyramid. So you can see here the base of pyramid. Typically, at that time, they were building pyramids on top of pyramids. So you can see the first pyramid and then the second one and then the third one. And then they decapitated, if you want, the pyramid to build a church, Nuestra Señora de los Remedios. And here is the church with a very classical Baroque, I would say, interior, which could have been built in Europe easily. Still in Puebla, Puebla is incredibly rich as far as churches. This is the convent of San Domingo de Guzman in Puebla, and particularly the architecture of that church is not special, but when you come in, part of the one of the chapels of the church is incredible. And again, we refer to the indigenous art, if you want to take it, as I mentioned before, with incredible decoration of vegetation, fruits, particular animals and all around, mixed with the the Christian iconography. Sometimes the architecture is quite special and typical. Puebla, this is the Church of San Francisco Acatepec. They discovered with talavera tiles of different colors that are actually following the colors of Mary, with the blue and the yellow and then the red, but all made of talavera mosaics. Here you have a detail. Now, the architecture remains Chirurguesque, but is almost lost within the color of the facade. Inside, we have again a deluge of gold with the main altar and the side altars, all, even the pulpit is all gilded. The cathedral in Puebla is rather dark colored, is rather forbidding again. It has suffered a lot from multiple earthquakes. We have to realize Puebla is next to the Popocatépetl volcano and another volcano, large volcano there. So very much subject to earthquakes. But here is the more classical rendering of the high altar in Puebla Cathedral. And the main painting, by the way, is by one of the most important Mexican painter, Cristobal de Villalpando. Some more of Puebla with the Santa Maria Tonantzintla, which is really actually a merging of the idea of the Virgin and the Godmother, the Godmother, yeah. So you have that mixing of both, if you want, and it's quite visible when you come into the church, that incredible work, indigenous iconography that mixes the Virgin Mary and that Mother Goddess. That's what I meant to say, the Mother Goddess, because there are lots of references to some of the attributes of the Mother Goddess. You can see all the fruits, and then the little angels, by the way, don't have European features anymore, but much more indigenous population features. Moving south, we have the monastery of Santo Domingo de Guzman in Oaxaca. Again, rather very solid, thick walls, very elaborate entrance and towers, but the rest is rather plain. It's part of the buildings of the University of Oaxaca now. The interior, though, is quite incredible, with a great retablo in the center, but then look at the ornamentation of the ceilings and the sides and the arches. And here's the decoration of the cupola that would be above the crossing. Quite different is the Basilica of Nuestra Señora de Soledad in Oaxaca, with that quite interesting, almost, it looks like they've changed their mind in the middle of the elaboration of the facade. It's a Baroque, very articulated Baroque architecture with columns, Corinthian columns and Ionic columns. So they have the three orders. So you have the Dorian, Ionian, and then Corinthian column, and then, of course, statues of different saints. South of Oaxaca, the Ocotlan, the state of Ocotlan, has the more gentle architecture. It's a very different style. The temple of San Domingo de Guzman in Ocotlan was a Dominican, of course, monastery. And the whole complex still exists. So the church is being used for worship, and the cloister area is used as a museum. And a very classical, very airy and luminous, but less typically Spanish or Mexican, I should say. In Mérida, Yucatan, the old Cathedral of Mérida was built on the site of the Mayan ruins of To. It was the first cathedral to be finished on the mainland of the Americas. It's actually built and inspired by the architecture in Úbeda in Spain, which is between Malaga and Granada, in south of Granada. It's a small, I would say small city, but has absolute treasures in it. And here you see the Basilica de Santa María de los Reales Casares in Úbeda. In Chiapas, so we're getting close to the Guatemaltec border, is the state of Chiapas, and very different architecture. The temple of Santo Domingo de Guzman, again, is a Dominican convent in Chiapas, with that white facade underlined with dark red. And still in Chiapas, another Dominican architecture, also in, but very beautiful. It's a different feeling, that ochre yellow with a very elegant facade, but much simpler. So we now leaving Mexico and moving to Guatemala. I'm not going to show you much about Guatemala. Again, Guatemala has suffered tremendously of earthquake, as you can imagine. This church was founded by the Mercedarians. That was a male monastery, and absolutely beautiful architecture. You have a mixture of stone, white stone, and then that very pale yellow. That church suffered a lot of the earthquake in 1773. And at that time, the capital of Guatemala was moved to a new place, because almost the entire town was destroyed. And so it was moved from Santiago de los Caballeros de Guatemala at the new place, which is called now the Nueva Guatemala de la Asunción. They were going to move the entire interior of the church, and people were absolutely desperate because they were living there. And so they carried some of the sculpture by foot all the way to the new building that was in construction at that time. And just to show the reverence they had towards these. Here is the church after one of the last earthquakes. And this was the image of the Christ that used to be there, that was transported to the new church. The interior that has been restored shows once a year that extraordinary display of seeds and vegetables and fruits as a carpet made in honor of Christ. But they're not only cathedrals, but there are some extraordinary little churches. And this is one so typical of Guatemala that goes back to the 17th century. And again, is that syncretic religion that is a mixture of the previous beliefs and the Christian religion. I've been trying to look for some interesting churches in the other countries, but again, we deal with wars and we deal with earthquakes, continuous earthquakes. So in Tegucigalpa, the cathedral in Honduras, a simpler facade that is, you would say, a simple interpretation of the Chirogores that we have seen in Mexico, but extraordinary retablo inside. And finally, in Panama, there are some churches, but they've been so remodeled because of the earthquake that they were not that interesting to be shown. But I thought this was, as we know, we've seen mission after mission that obviously have accomplished a lot of good, and particularly with the Jesuits, and we'll see it even more, I think, in South America. The Jesuits really organized a system where they protected the population against the excess of the rest, and protected it so much that nobody had access to it. It was very well protected. So this is one of these missions of the Compañía de Jesús in Casco Vieja in Panama that shows its splendor. It must have been extraordinary, but unfortunately has suffered from not only earthquakes, but then a lack of restoration, a lack of care. Why? Because with the revolution, it was often anti-clerical, and so they didn't want to re-emphasize the religion. And if they had no use for it, it was left in the condition that you see there. This is just a shell. It used it was built in 1741, and it was destroyed by a fire and then further damaged in an earthquake. But you can imagine how, again, beautiful it was. So I hope this has been just a small panorama of all the beauties you can find in Mesoamerica. Next, on August the 3rd, we'll have the ancient art in South America. And I think this is also an extremely interesting topic. So I'm going to stop the